patience. I'm just going to quickly share my screen. So what we've heard basically are various strategic and operational issues that some of these groups are going to face and are facing. My focus is looking specifically at jihadist stroke Islamist type networks and organizations, and perhaps what they are having to contend with and will be contending with post-COVID-19. Basically, to keep this as short and as simple as possible, what you've got is a macro level view here. And if I point the audience to, we start here at strategic issues, an overview suggests what does the pandemic do to the desired objectives of violent extremist groups. And I think this is an important point straight off the bat in terms of strategy, because all VEOs, jihadists, right wing, left wing, whatever their ideological inclination may be, have end state objectives, something that they seek to achieve, some aim or some decisive condition. Now, just like many liberal democracies, governments, countries, and nations have been caught completely, relatively by surprise by this pandemic, so too have violent extremist organizations, including jihadist groups. That doesn't mean to say that their communication has been non-existent, because you've seen the evidence of that earlier. But the point here is the impact of the pandemic surely impacts the strategic objectives of these groups. And so we will have to wait and see post-COVID-19 what their new terrain looks like for them in terms of what they want to achieve. Now, if I move you onto this side, alongside the strategic issues, then there's the issue of how they will look at what we call in economics a cost-benefit analysis. They will have to assess their possible gains versus possible losses in everyday needs and issues within this context. So in other words, where can they take risks? What risk may lead to a reward for them? What type of reward are they looking for? How does risk or cost or benefit impact recruitment, and how does it impact retention? Now, on the other side of this situation, we move down to another issue that's very important in this context, and that's around framing. So here we've got creating references. These groups and organizations will need to think about what references they're using. And what I mean by that, which ones are going to be more effective. For example, they need the right framing for a reference around how do they reinforce their central ideological message? Does the message change because of the situation they found themselves in? And that leads me to the second point there, which says contextualizing the pandemic and their cause. So in other words, unless they can frame their messaging in a way that gives context to what their cause is about in relation to COVID-19, they may find that they don't have a very active audience. And one of the ways in which this happens is through things you've already quickly just come across, but I've put here appropriating the situation to create a sense of ownership over the narrative. And a very harsh version of that is in brackets, i.e. one of the initial narratives that came out was the pandemic is a punishment. Not a punishment for the true believer, but a punishment for the non-believer, those who we fight against, for example. So this issue around framing becomes very, very important when both jihadist groups, violent extremist organizations have been caught by surprise, just like everybody else. If we move on a bit, we've got to this stage. This means that they require a period of rationalizing. Now, from a psychology perspective, this is called sense making. They are going to need to make sense of what's going on around them. And you've heard some of this stuff, but I'll just recap it. So you've got narratives such as conspiracy theories. You've got narratives that form as a result of grievances because of perhaps issues that certain communities are facing because of COVID-19 and others may not be facing. You've got the always existent narratives of violent extremist groups that will play on the issue of oppression of some groups, of some particular subsection of a population that is being oppressed. And finally, as a result of using some of these, some organizations, networks, groups may seek to use action narratives. So what do we do about this grievance? What do we do about the fact that we believe this is a conspiracy? Or what do we do about the fact that our brothers and sisters are being oppressed? Once you move past the rationalizing stage, once you've made sense of COVID-19 and your objectives, you move to perhaps, potentially an issue around repurposing. What does repurposing mean in this context? Well, what's the effect of the pandemic on these groups' plans, on their logistics, on their finances, on how they recruit, who they recruit, on what tools and mediums they use for engagement, which ones will be more effective when people are already living in fear, and ultimately how these effects might also impact on the group or network's branding, how it comes across, the public, security and government perception of what this group or organization or network is trying to say. And you've seen high glossy quality content already presented to you here that some networks have put out, and you see some very basic quality content. So these are issues that they're going to have to think about, and they are thinking about. Do we effectively repurpose what we stand for to make the best out of the COVID-19 situation? And then moving here onto the left-hand side of the screen, what's the individual considerations that perhaps supporters or those who have not made up their mind, those who are indifferent to these narratives, what are the issues they're facing? These networks also have to consider that. So the impact of the pandemic on motivation levels, on support levels, passive or active, on levels of recruitment, perhaps different places for recruitment. They have to take into account the psychological context, individual level. How more or less vulnerable are the existing populations? If we just put out a narrative that says, if you do your ablution 5 times a day, you can't catch COVID-19, will this convince some people that we are on the right path or the straight path, for example? They have to look at the priorities of individuals who are trying to stay alive during a very serious situation. So if someone says, you know, we must enjoin the good and forbid the evil, a response may be from someone who's on lockdown to say, I'm actually just trying to stay alive. So can we talk about this another time if I manage to make it out of here? And then we're looking at ideas around how more or less resilient or receptive to the cause may individuals be who are fighting to stay alive at this moment in time and do not have other opportunities to think about their great calling in life that may be some kind of some kind of version of jihad or fighting. Now, where this leads us to, for example, very quickly, is we're looking at the issue from cause versus context. What would be the best strategy in the circumstances for a violent extremist group? This is something that we often don't consider on our side of the fence, but when you realize, or when you quickly think about government responses to COVID-19 and how some have appeared to be very disjointed, please do not think for 1 minute that the violent extremist organizations aren't as disjointed in the minimum as our own authorities may be. So they are also thinking about method. What's the best way in which, does our modus operandi change? Do our tactics change? They therefore have to make decisions, and these decisions may be based on what is the best thing for us in the short term, the medium term, and the long term, if we want our ideological objectives to survive. You know, we have to make the right decision now. We've got to be seen to be positive, or we've got to be seen to be able to recruit more numbers or be able to carry out more operations. And some of those decisions will be based on accurate or useful reading of the global temperature. What's going on? What's the sentiment? How are communities, societies, and nations feeling? And as a result of that reading of the global temperature, then comes the ultimate decision for groups that have lost territories, for groups that have lost resources, for example. Do we use this time to rebuild more quietly, or do we use this time to react suddenly and with force? And in conclusion, where that leaves us is a situation that in any such ideological context of Islamist or jihadist context, there is always a personal perspective to recruitment, support, and action. There's always a public or communal level of this support, action, and understanding, and there's always an ideological level of support, understanding, and action. And so the decision to rebuild or react has to be based on those 3 factors if any violent extremist organization or non-violent extremist organization is seeking to survive a situation where the rest of the world is surviving, trying to survive as well, because ironically, they too are human beings and are deep down being affected by the virus. So some of these strategic and operational things, I hope have helped frame some of the considerations that they might be looking at. And coming last is never easy, but I thank you for your patience in listening to that, and I hope some of that was useful. Thank you.